Well, hello. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about cover crops. Cover crops are a big hit right now in the country. We were just at a meeting in Tampa Bay with the American Society of Agronomy session, and I tell you what, there were more cover crop talks than I've seen in 30 years. It's unbelievable. It's just an explosion of people wanting to work with cover crops. So I guess to start with, we'll just define what a cover crop is. So what is a cover crop? You know, it's a crop that we plant like we usually plant any crop, either drilling or planting, usually drilling. Sometimes they're broadcasts, but it's not intended for harvest, so you're not going to harvest this crop. So why would you want to do that? Well, the traditional reasons for cover crops was really this: to reduce soil erosion, to both wind and water erosion. If you got the soil covered with something growing, then the rain doesn't really impact that ground, and it hits the plants and it protects the soil, and you don't have as much runoff and erosion because you've got roots holding the ground and you've got plants providing a surface for the rain to impact. Same thing with wind. If wind is blowing, if there's plants out there, that keeps it from picking up soil particles and causing wind erosion. The other main thing for cover crops is to prevent nutrient leaching. So you've got plants that are taking up nutrients that are sitting there in the soil, like nitrate is the main one we look at, and it brings it up into the plant and turns it into an organic nitrogen inside that plant, and so it keeps it from leaching out at the below the root level. So the other one they're talking about is really improving soil quality, and so what does that really mean? You know, primarily it's probably adding carbon to the system. So as you add plants fix carbon from CO2 through photosynthesis, and so some of that carbon, either through when they die and decompose, also through leaching or sloughing off of the roots, there's carbon goes into the system, the soil system. You can increase soil organic matter. You add diversity, and so diversity is always good in terms of pests, primarily in terms of getting a way to fight insects or diseases, those kinds of things, nematodes. So when you have mostly a grass, like we're in a wheat fallow system, if you add broadleaf crops to that as a cover crop, then you've got a different type of plant species out there which attracts different pests than what is going to attack your wheat. Adding a living organism. A lot of people talk about this. I hear NRCS talk about this a lot, about adding a living organism, having something growing all the time out there in the field. It sounds good. I don't know how really important that is, but it is true. When you go fallow, it's like a virtual desert to living things. You keep things from growing. You've got bacteria and you've got earthworms. You have other things that are living below the soil surface. But as far as keeping a living organism out there, that may play a role. It may be a good thing. And then the other one is adding flowers. It provides a source of nectar for pollinators, so for honeybees and other pollinators. And in our system for crop production, we don't really need a lot of pollinators for what we do. I guess alfalfa needs pollinators. Certain crops do, but wheat really doesn't need it. Corn, you know, where they grow corn, it doesn't really need a pollinator to make that work. And building soil structure so that you can improve water movement, or basically to try and increase infiltration rates, so the water that falls on that soil moves quickly into the soil and doesn't run off the field. And then changing that microenvironment tries to help control plant pests, kind of like I said before, where you've got different species out there. It attracts different things that are going to feed on that. You have predators. It's just the whole ecosystem is better with a lot of a diversity of crops out there. So this is all true for the humid east. As you move west into the semi-arid environment, it makes it tough because now you're trading off the main thing that we are limited for yield is water. And so if you use water to grow a cover crop, that typically impacts the yield of your money crop. And so a cover crop that doesn't give you any income may improve soil quality, but it may not be sustainable for you or for the farmer in the short term. So the long term, it may be a good thing, but it may take a long time, and it typically does take a long time to build up soil quality and to change soil quality. But cover crops are known for building soil quality. There's lots of testimonials about low water use. I believe most of those water crops plants use water, whether they're a cover crop or whether they're a grain crop. If they're growing and photosynthesizing, they're using water. You can manage that by killing them, before they make seed, for example, or using crops that are just very shallow rooted. You can manage a little bit of that water use, but they typically use water. There's actually better data on increased organic matter, better infiltration, aggregate stability improvements, those kinds of things. There's lots of data. Cover crops have been used for years in different regions, and so we know that really does happen, but it's primarily in the humid regions and not really here in the semi-arid environment. I've got this statement about precipitation: too little for continuous wheat, but too much for wheat fallow. If you just think about that for a second, we get in Montana, in the wheat growing regions, 12 to 14 inches of annual precipitation. We need around 18 inches probably to grow a really good wheat crop or barley crop. Well, if you're getting 2 years to grow the one crop, that's 24 to 28 inches in that period, and that's really more than you really need for wheat. And so there's a little bit more than what you need for a wheat fallow system, but so maybe there's enough that you could put a cover crop in that system and make it work. The word you get from a lot of people that are promoting cover crops is just plant them and you'll be successful. And I really have to think, is that really true? That just seems, it's just a pipe dream. We have a lot of questions, not a lot of answers for how they work in this environment. Questions like, when should we put them in the system? When to plant? And I have a little graphic here in a minute. We'll kind of talk about that in more detail. When to terminate. So if you're in a wheat fallow system, if you grow a cover crop all the way up to wheat planting time, you're not going to have much moisture most years to plant and be successful growing that cover crop or growing the wheat crop, or getting it established. So it really makes termination is a big issue, how to terminate that. Some people have just promoted letting winter terminate the crop. Well, that works fine for a spring planted crop, but for winter wheat, it doesn't really work very well. In our environment, we just don't have enough moisture to be able to terminate the crop and immediately plant back into that and have enough to germ a wheat seed. What should the makeup of the cover crop be? Should it be a single species? Should it be a mixture? If it's a single species, what species should we plant? Should it be a legume? Should it be a brassica? It's lots of questions. Should it be a mixture? And if it's a mixture, what should the mixture be made of? What are the mixtures? What kind of species need to be in that mixture? And this is an issue we've discovered just doing this research on it. Is you've got really fine small seed like teff, for example, is a really tiny seed. Some of the legumes like crimson clover are very small seeds, and you're planting with big seeds like peas, dry pea seed, or lentils, or barley, or triticale. Those need to be planted in 1.5 to 2 inches deep. Those shallow seeds need to be planted in 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. How do you do in one pass plant all these different seed sizes and make them all emerge and all compete? There's no sense planting them if you don't get them up growing as a plant. And so the big question is, what's the impact to the cash crop following this if we have a cover crop? Is it a positive impact? Is it a negative impact? If it's negative, how much is it going to cost me to grow a cover crop in my following wheat crop? I saw a lot of data at Tampa saying there's no impact, no negative impact of using a cover crop. And this is from data from Pennsylvania, from Florida, Georgia, Kansas, moving west all around, but no impact is promoted as a good thing. But maybe, I don't know, we can't just bet on that in our environment. So then this last one is, can I feed this to cattle or to sheep or to goats? And that really gets down to, is it really a cover crop when you start talking about feeding it? In my mind, it's no longer a cover crop. If it's now a forage crop. It's because you're growing this and you're going to get some income indirectly, but you're getting some income from this crop. There was a talk I went to from some people in Minnesota that are in a they're in a corn, soybean system in that area, the Midwest of the U.S., right? Well, they were putting camelina, a winter camelina, in the corn soybean system. So they would plant corn, and right at side dress time when they put nitrogen down, and it's about the last time you can get across that corn before it's too tall, they'll go through and they put nitrogen down. At the same time, they're spreading camelina seed. The camelina gets established, and as the corn matures, the camelina makes a little rosette at the bottom, and it doesn't bolt till the next spring. So they harvest the corn. The next spring, the camelina bolts. It starts to grow upright, and as it grows upright, it gets about to last you get through there, they plant soybeans right through this green camelina crop. The camelina matures about the middle to late June. They harvest it. The soybean pops through, and it becomes a soybean crop that they harvest in the fall. So now they're getting 3 crops in 2 years, and they're calling that a cash cover crop. And I said, well, we asked them, why do you call that a cover crop if you're growing it? Well, because it's a cover, and but we're also getting some money for it. And I didn't think of it at the time, but later I thought, that definition, with that definition, you could call the soybean the cover crop and the camelina the cash crop. Really, it's not a cover crop. It's just that's a relay cropping system, and they're growing 3 crops in 2 years. So there's a lot of talk and a lot of wishy-washy definitions of cover crops. I think we should go back to the definition that a cover crop is a crop that we plant and we don't harvest for any money. It's going to do another function. It's going to either build soil quality, or it's going to prevent leaching. It's going to do things to improve the operation, but it's not going to give you money directly. How long does it take? This last statement, when will soil quality improve? I think it's going to take several cycles. And so if you're in a wheat fallow system and you grow a cover crop every other year, 3 cycles would be a 6-year process before you could even expect to start measuring some differences in soil quality. I think 3 cycles is at a minimum, and a lot of times it might take 5, 6 cycles, which might be 10, 12 years down the road for us. This is my little graphic to try and explain the wheat fallow cycle. This is a 2-year circle, so I'm going to use my mouse as a pointer. So we plant, well, this is year 1, right, straight up and down. It goes all the way around to the bottom, and that's 1 year, and then the second year goes from the left half of the circle back around here. So in that time, we plant wheat in the fall before this January 1st period. Then winter arrives, and there's really no growth through that period from whenever we freeze up, December 1st, let's say, to maybe the end of March, depending on where in the state we are. Then the majority of that growth occurs really from March until we harvest that wheat in August. And then right after that, we have wheat stubble. We go into winter. We have more wheat stubble that we're traditionally catching most of our rainfall in to rebuild that profile to go back into winter wheat. So 1 crop of wheat in these 2 pie sections over a 2-year period. So there's 2 places that you could put cover crops in this system. You could put it here right after wheat harvest, or here right after that first winter. So let's say we put it here. The hard part about doing it here is it's bone dry coming out of wheat harvest. Typically, there's very little moisture unless you happen to get a rain right at harvest time or right after harvest to get those seeds established. There's very little chance that you're going to get very much establishment. And if you do happen to get establishment, you don't have a lot of time, and it's cooling off before you hit winter. And so the accumulation of organic matter or biomass is pretty low, probably less than 1,000 pounds per acre that you can accumulate in most years before you get to winter. And then winter kills it. That's the nice thing. It doesn't cost you any money to kill it. And then you'd have this whole next year to gather water like you normally do. So you could put one in this window and have some success if you got rains, if you had the conditions for it. More likely, you're going to let that stay fallow to winter, and then in the next spring you could plant a cover crop. So this is a more likely to be successful growing a cover crop is in this window here, right before going back to wheat. But like I said before, if you grow this right up against wheat planting time, there's going to be very little moisture to plant the wheat into. So you probably are going to have to terminate this either with tillage or with a Roundup glyphosate spray or something to terminate that crop to gain a few weeks or a month of moisture accumulation to get back into wheat. And then hopefully you'll have the rain through the spring to finish out that wheat crop. So those are the two windows. The other way would be to, if you wanted to go from a wheat fallow system, I have this graphic which didn't have the pretty pictures in it. This is what we did for this study. So rather than doing a winter wheat fallow system, I decided I wanted to have a crop, but I was going to let winter terminate it, and so there's really no chance of putting in winter wheat. So we went to a spring wheat or a spring barley system, just to see the impact of this cover crop on a following crop. And then hopefully, if we understand, if we can see soil changes over a few cycles of this, we can measure those and give us some economic value for the changes in soil quality. We'd have some understanding of how to make it work in a wheat fallow system. So that's the study I would like to present. There's two studies, this one, and then I have a second study that was more statewide that we'll talk about. So this is the study. It's a mixed species cover crop study in Huntley, Montana. Spring barley cover crop rotation. So the idea is increased frequency of cover crops will help drive soil quality changes, and we'll use a spring crop rather than a winter wheat, and that way we can use the full period to grow a cover crop and let freeze kill out those cover crops. We had 6 different species. We had grasses, and we put them into functional groups of grasses, legumes, and then taproot crops. So the grasses are barley and forage sorghum, the legumes are spring pea and soybean, and the taproots are turnip and safflower. So I have each one of those, that's 6 plots. Then we had one where we mixed all those together, so you've got a mixture of all 6 species. And then we had a mixture of minus the functional group. So basically grasses plus taproots as a one plot, then grasses plus legumes as another plot, and then legumes plus taproots as another plot. So that gives you 10 different treatments, and then we had Kim Fowler makes 11 treatments. The following year we plant barley, and we put nitrogen rates of 0, 20, 40, and 60 pounds per acre nitrogen, just to see if using these cover crops gives you a nitrogen benefit. With the spring pea and soybean being legumes, you think you might get a nitrogen benefit. And so we had the space to do it. We decided to go ahead and do it that way. This is the tool we use. This is a Seedmaster air drill, and we bought this from them. It's a 15-foot wide, just the base model without the wings on it that most farmers would have. This would be a 70-foot or 100-foot wide drill. We're just 15-foot wide, but it's still the same design. So it's got the same hydraulic down pressure air delivery system to 2 tubes. So you can put the seed down through this knife here, and there's a shielded knife here that you can put fertilizer down. So our rates for seeding rate, which is another question, especially for species we don't really have good numbers for. These we do. We planted barley at 17 plants per square foot when it was just barley as a cover crop. Forage sorghum 1.5, soybean 4.5, dry pea 9, safflower 6.5, and turnip at 6 plants per square foot. When we mixed all of them, we took all those and mixed them in one bucket, and we changed the rate to a sixth of that. So divide barley by 6, it'd be a little bit under 3 plants per square foot was the target with the full mix. When we mix with just 4, Then we divided that 17 by 4, so it would be around a little over 4 plants per square foot of barley, and the same for all the other species in there. So that gave us a targeted mix so that each square foot would have the same opportunity to grow, an equal opportunity to grow each one of those species in those mixtures. Just run through some pictures of kind of what it looked like, and this is, I think it was in August when we took these pictures. This is a barley plot, and you can see the barley is already matured and made seed. It was pretty dry, and these weeds, we had a lot of weed pressure this is the second year of this study. And so you can see this, as the barley matured, then the weeds started greening up underneath that and taking over. We could have sprayed this out and controlled them, but in the mixtures you really can't spray them out because we don't really have any herbicides that will not take out some of those species if we sprayed them. So we just let them go so they were treated the same. Here's the forage sorghum. There's some weeds down in here, but not nearly as much. There's a lot more growthy, and it's still green here at the end of August, and so it's still competing well against those weeds. Peas, same as the barley, it's made seed, and it's sitting there, and once it's made seed, it's not really competing against, and those moisture is available for those weeds to take over. Here's a soybean plot. Soybean stand could have been a little bit higher. You can see in the background, you can see the second rep, and or this might be the third. It's another rep. There's a 60-foot alley in between. This is the turnip, and if you look, you can find a turnip. Here's one here, and there's one right here, but primarily the turnips did not establish well. So the weeds just took over that plot, and that's a typical problem for a fine-seeded crop like that. You've really got to get it established, and planting it a little bit later. We planted it in late May, so we could get towards the heat of the growing season. It wasn't good for a cool season crop like turnip to do that to it. It grows best early spring and in the fall. This isn't in the plots, this is in another area just to show you the pressure we have on pests on turnip. There's a little black insect called the flea beetle, which just riddles these leaves with holes and puts a lot of pressure on turnips. And so not only in a dry environment, this is under irrigation where we did this, but in the dry land area where there's not a lot of extra moisture and it's hot and under insect pressure, the turnip just has a tough time competing in our environment. This is a cover crop. It's actually a crop. Safflower is a crop in the rest of the state, but as a cover crop, it really does a very good job of competing against the weeds and keeping weeds down. It grows late into the season, so if you're trying to fill that window, I think safflower might be an opportunity crop for us to do that. It's a big seed. It's easy to plant, easy to mix with oats or with barley, and so you plant it at the same depth. It's not a problem that way. But safflower is also known for using a lot of water, deep water. So how's that going to impact the following money crop? That's probably one of the questions. This is the mixtures. So here you can see the safflower and forage sorghum pretty much dominate most of this. There's a few soybeans that are visible if you start digging around looking in there, but not a lot. This is without the grasses. It's pretty much dominated by safflower, but there's some soybeans here and here. This is all minus the legumes. It's pretty much, I don't see very much of the barley. It's primarily the forage sorghum and the safflower that made this mixture. And then you take the safflower as a taproot, and then you're left with forage sorghum and soybean as the two main drivers of this mixture. And then we have the chem fallow with one little escape in there. So there's the yield of those pictures I just showed you at the end of the season. And so we had a tremendous amount of forage sorghum, almost 11,000 pounds per acre of above ground biomass. But look at the turnip, less than maybe 100 pounds per acre, very little. And the others are in between. And so the one thing we've seen doing this for 3 or 4 years now, and others have seen, is that by having a mixture, you're more likely to get a manageable amount of biomass. It may not be equally distributed across all the mixtures you put in there, but you're not getting these extremes of really high if you just happen to pick the right crop for the right environment that year, or you pick the wrong one, something's going to like the environment. If you have a good mixture of different species, you're going to get 3,000-4,000 pounds per acre growth. So that's what you want. You want to have some biomass, that not too much, but something that you can plant through, something that provides you some carbon. So now let's look at barley planting time. This is the water content at barley planting time, and probably for reference we should look at the fallow first. And so this is just gravimetric. We took soil samples down to 3 feet, and we had almost 8 inches of water in that profile, pretty full profile to go into the season for barley. And if you look at any of the other ones, their turnip, which really was just basically a weed plot, had 6 inches of water. So it's in the peas, which matured early, caught some later rains, and some of these that had these warm season crops that used up some of that water. So this is after winter recharge. So there was some winter recharge, and because I would think coming out of at the end of the fall, there was probably very little water in this safflower plot, but it's back to 5 inches by after the winter time. So that's a big difference, should drive barley yields. If you look at nitrate, that's the other big driver. Look at the nitrate that's in the fallow plot. We've got almost 50 pounds of nitrate that's mineralized, is sitting there waiting for a barley or wheat crop to take up. So that's probably is not going to see much of a response to nitrogen in that environment. Where's the nitrate for where all these cover crops are? Well, it mineralized like it did here, but it got taken up by these crops. So it's in the biomass of these crops, sitting there as an organic nitrogen that has to decompose and be mineralized and then taken up by the following crop. Is that going to happen in this system? I really don't know. And so that's kind of what this part of this test is all about. Well, here's the barley crop that we planted following those cover crops. And so let me orient you to what this looks like. We've planted the cover crops were planted this direction. And you see this dark green area, which is probably a fallow plot. And here's a strip here. You can see a little bit different green. So this green is kind of a reflection of a little bit more water, a little bit more nitrate that mineralized maybe and occurred later. So you can see there is a difference in treatments probably of these 11 treatments or 15-foot wide plots. But we only got 6 inches of rainfall during the growing season, which is not a lot. So if you go back to what we had here, 6 plus 8 is about 14 inches of rain. Not bad for a barley crop, but all the rest of them are living on less than 12 inches of rainfall. Some of them 10 inches of rainfall to get this barley. So not in both years it was pretty tough during the growing season for that season of barley. I had this at 2 different locations. That's why I had 2 years with barley. So we just repeated the study side by side, basically. Here are the nitrogen treatment, the yields due to nitrogen treatment for barley. Yields did not respond to nitrogen because the yield levels are so low. I'd say 16 to 17. You can see the nitrogen did get into the plant. It's in terms of protein is pretty high. Higher in rates, higher in amount of protein. Test weight is low, protein is high. This would not make malt quality barley by any stretch of the imagination. Plumps are better than I would expect for that kind of environment. If you look at grain yield following different cover crop species, compared to fallow, here's fallow at 41.2 bushels. So in that tough environment, we still got 41 bushel of barley under fallow conditions. But any place we had a cover crop, the best I could do was 20 bushel. So that's a 50% or more than 50% reduction in yield due to having a cover crop previous to that. So that's the trade-off. The trade-off is maybe we're changing soil quality. We haven't measured that yet, but you don't get something for nothing. It's going to cost you in yield to do this over time. You may start to see less of a decrease. If we had a rainy year, maybe we wouldn't have seen a difference in yield. Maybe it would have made up for that. Another 4 or 5 inches probably would have made a huge difference and washed out some of these differences in yield. If I average the 2 years together of barley, here's the fallow. The yield on fallow is right around 50 bushel, a little bit better yield the year before, and a little less severe of a drought. We actually had a little bit better yields. And so I think I put this in here. We'll ignore the turnip because you saw the picture of the turnip field. It's really a pigweed field is what it is, and didn't use as much water. Probably those weeds didn't as because they came on late in the summer than what a crop of turnip probably would have used. So pea is the next best yield following that, and it reached on average of 2 years 66% of fallow. And let's say the sorghum and soybean as cover crops were in that range. These are also, they're around 54% of fallow. So probably our impact to a following crop, I'd say somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on the year. It could be less than 30 if we had a rainy year, but it's definitely not zero, definitely not a no impact to the following crop. This was the design for those 2 seasons. This year we went to changed a little bit because since it was barley, I wanted to have something other than barley that's not diverse at all. So oats and millet became the grasses. Millet's a little bit lower growing and not quite so tall, and maybe not quite so likely to grow such high a biomass as the sorghum did. The legumes are pea, and then we switched out soybeans to cowpea, and cowpea is stays vegetative a lot longer, so it makes it less likely to make seed at the end of the season, where soybean tends to make seed towards the end of the season. Taproot stayed the same, turnip and safflower. We added a group we're naming Brassica, where we have radish and mustard in the mix. So kind of the same design. You can see it from here. We have all of them mixed together, all 8 mixed together. And then these are mixtures of 6 minus a functional group. And then rather than plant each individuals, I just tried to fit this on top of the same design we had before, the same area in the field, and match them up so they're kind of in similar areas. We mixed the functional groups, so all the brassicas together, all the grasses together. And here's the data. It is a little more stable yields, I'd say, than what we had with the other design. So I think we're probably zeroing in on a little bit better mixture of species. But the brassica mix, you can see, did not do very good, 300 pounds. And we measured weeds this time. So this is a percent of this column. Pretty much, if they produce 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of dry matter, above ground dry matter, there was very few weeds, 3 to 5%. This is 8% in the all minus the grass. The grasses really help keep down the weeds. But where we had the brassica mix, and there was very little growth, we had more weeds than we had dry matter. But even if you add that together, it's less than 1,000 pounds total. The other point, the legume mix drops off, and so they aren't as competitive as the grasses. Again, the grasses are the ones that do the best. If you look at the mixture composition, so this bottom one is the full mix of all 8 species. And if they'd all competed equally, then each colored bar should cover 25% of this bar. This is a 0 to 100%. But you can see the brassicas just don't compete very well. The grasses are almost 50% of that mix. The biomass is coming out of the grass. The legumes are this darker green area, and it's about 15%. And so the safflower, it's dominated by grasses and then safflower for that mixture of 8 different species. This exclamation point is to indicate without brassica or without grass. So this bar, the middle bar, is without grass. So there's no light green in here. And there you can see the safflower, the taproot species, really dominates. In all the others, the grasses definitely dominate. So I think rather than dividing by the number of crops in a mix, we're going to have to divide by that number, and then for grasses, cut it in half again, probably, to get it so that it's not dominated by the grasses. It's just because grasses are very aggressive and they're adapted to this region. So that's kind of what this graph is telling us. The other study I'd like to talk about is the M-Ready study that we did at 6 locations across the state at the research centers. There's 7 research centers in the state. So this is southern where I'm at. This is eastern over at Sidney. This is northern at Havre. This is central at Moccasin. There's one up here north of Great Falls called Western Triangle, but their data was not included in this. And then we have 2 over in the mountains, one at Kalispell, and then one down at Corvallis. And so those are the 6 locations. We compared various species for potential use as cover crops. This whole effect was just to try and figure out what grows best at each location, and putting together something that produces biomass quickly and doesn't go to seed right away would be kind of the criteria for putting together mixtures. And so we just need to do that at each location to kind of figure that out. And we had 2 planting dates. We had a mid-April and then a late May planting date. And there's just a couple pictures of what they look like. Oh, I guess the other thing to tell you is we took the weights of these biomass when the grasses in that mix started to make seed. So this is triticale. When it starts to make seed, we terminated that early planting date, and we estimated biomass at that point. So we just would harvest several meters of row and then dry it in an oven, and then the data I'll show you is the dry weight that was created. So here's sunflowers. This is the warm mix, and this is an alternative late mix. These mixtures are here, and the names, I argue, they're maybe not the best names because the cool season has safflower in it, which safflower is not a cool season crop. The warm season has these, all of them have radish and turnip in them. It was kind of driven by NRCS. They're pushing these root crops to be in the system, and so the majority vote said let's include those on all of the studies and all the designs. So this is the different ones. You can see teff is in here as an alternative. We chose Indian corn just because it's not a Roundup ready corn, and it also is a kind of a low growing species that kind of tillers out and doesn't grow up more than about 3 foot high, which is kind of nice instead of being an 8 foot tall plant out there. Faba bean, that was the one you saw right here that's blooming. That's faba bean, an interesting species. Black bean is a dry bean, which pushes the price up quite a bit. Some of these are pretty pricey mixtures, so that's the other thing to keep in mind. If you're going to spend seeding costs, not even including the planting costs, just the seed cost is $20 to $40 per acre. So that's not an insignificant impact for a crop that you're not going to harvest. Chickpea probably drove this price up here. That's probably maybe canola, the 2 that are going to be pricey in that group. So here's the average biomass from 4 of the locations averaged together: Havre, Huntley, Moccasin, and Sidney. It's kind of the same story. You see up and down through individual species. In the mixtures, it's a little more stable yields. This is early planted, this is late planted. The grasses are the ones that are the tallest bars: oats, triticale, Indian corn, German millet, sorghum. Sunflower is actually pretty good. It's not a grass. It does fairly well, and canola does fairly well. I'd say, if I was putting things together, sunflower might be a good one to include in this. Millet is what we went to here at Southern on that other study. So there is an effect on planting date on mixture and biomass production. So planting early and also terminating early, because this is when the oats and what else I had in here? There was oat. I was thinking I had barley, but the oat, when it's seeded, started to make seed, then we terminated all of the early species. And then the late went, so this termination occurred probably the end of June. And this termination was about the end of August. There's a lot more growing degree days, a lot more heat in the later planted, and thus you get better yields of that, up around 2,000 pounds per acre in some of those, versus less than 500 on this warm season. A warm season planted early just doesn't do very well. And then we looked at the forage quality. If you're going to feed this to animals at the end as another alternative use of a cover crop, I'm going to call it a forage crop. Very good protein levels. We did the full analysis of across. We just combined over reps, so I don't have any stats for this, but you can kind of see this pretty good quality for this early planted cover crops. This RFV is relative feed value as compared to alfalfa, like horse quality alfalfa would be at 100. The only thing that really falls below that is this triticale, which we know those grasses don't have the same quality. But look, some of these are twice, turnip are twice the value of alfalfa. But something to keep in mind is pretty high in nitrates. So when you start getting above 300 part per billion nitrate, then you've got a limit. If you're above 1,000, you have to limit how much that goes to animal feed because of the toxicity value. So if you're going to use these for cover crops, and a mixture, maybe I've heard this talked about, and haven't seen any data on it. It'd be a hard, expensive study to do, but cattle will avoid those with high nitrate or the ones that are toxic to them if they can choose other species to eat. But once it gets down, if it was just a turnip field and they're hungry, that's all they got to eat, you're probably going to lose a few animals because of this high, if the nitrates are that high. If you go to the later planted crops, the relative feed value is low for some of these grasses like sorghum and German millet and teff. But the rest of them are still fairly good quality. Protein levels are a little bit lower than what we saw with the early planted and early killed stuff. Nitrate levels, again, could still be a problem with some of these. So I would not just turn cattle loose in this. I would have it tested before we would feed any of this. So looking for soil quality changes, we're at that point where that study has gone 2 years on the same piece of ground, so 2 cycles. We'll start looking next spring to look at infiltration rates and aggregate stability. We may start looking at soil carbon. I may send those off for that analysis. The MReady study, this last one I just showed you, was a 1-year shot, so there was really no expectation that we could see measurable changes in soil properties in just growing them for 1 year. As something to support doing this now is in a rotation study. I think I presented, you may have heard me talk before on a crop rotation study we had for 6 years here. We did see some changes in particulate organic matter after 6 years of continuous crop versus the wheat fallow system. So I think there is hope that we could do that and start to see some changes in this rotation I have out here with the cover crops. That's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, please send me an email or contact me here. You can send an email to at this location. There's a link on that website to get to it, or just give me a phone call. I'd be glad to talk with you, and thank you for listening.